Michael Whitmore sat in the grand study of his penthouse, surrounded by an eerie silence that had settled over his life since Elizabeth's passing. Her absence felt like an open wound that refused to heal, and tonight, as the city lights twinkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, it ached more than usual. He poured himself a glass of scotch, but it tasted bitter, just like the empty accomplishments that now seemed to define him. Elizabeth had always been the heart of their world. She wasn't just his wife. She was his compass, his balance. And now, with her gone, he was adrift in a sea of wealth and power that offered no solace. As Michael swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his eyes fell upon a small, ornately carved wooden box on the desk. It was Elizabeth's. He had avoided opening it for months, fearing the memories it might awaken. But tonight, something drew him to it. His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside were letters, photographs, and little mementos from her life, a collection of her essence. Among them was a neatly folded piece of paper with her handwriting across the top. "For Michael, when you're ready." He unfolded the note with care, his breath catching in his throat as he read her words. "Dearest Michael, if you're reading this, I hope you're finding your way back to yourself. Life is too short to measure in success and wealth alone. You have always been a man of great purpose, but now it's time to discover the heart that lies beneath. Find the courage to step beyond the world you know and make a difference, not as the CEO of Whitmore Enterprises, but as Michael, the man I love. There's a list of places and people that meant so much to me. Start there. Make them mean something to you too. Love always, Elizabeth." The letter shook him to his core. It was Elizabeth's final request, a plea for him to do more than just exist. He unfolded the list attached to the letter, his eyes scanning the names and places she had cherished. One caught his attention immediately: the Whitmore Foundation, Starlight Shelter. He vaguely remembered Elizabeth's passion for the shelter, a safe haven for vulnerable children and struggling families. She had often spoken of it with such warmth, but Michael had always been too preoccupied to visit or understand its importance. Now, something inside him stirred, a strange, unfamiliar pull toward action. The next morning, Michael arrived at the Whitmore Foundation headquarters. Dressed in simple jeans and a faded shirt, he had shed his usual tailored suits and the air of authority that clung to him. He told no one of his plans, not even his executive assistant. For once, he didn't want to be the CEO. He wanted to be invisible. Under the guise of a potential volunteer, he arranged to work at the Starlight Shelter as a janitor. The idea seemed absurd, even to him, but it also felt right. If he was going to honor Elizabeth's wish, he needed to immerse himself in her world, not from the top, but from the ground level. His first day at the shelter was a jarring experience. The worn linoleum floors and faint smell of disinfectant were a stark contrast to the polished marble halls of Whitmore Enterprises. He spent hours cleaning bathrooms, mopping floors, and organizing supplies. It was grueling work, yet strangely grounding. For the first time in years, Michael wasn't being catered to. He was contributing in a way that felt honest. By midday, he found himself in the playroom, scrubbing crayon marks off the walls. That's when he noticed her. A small girl with unruly curls and an air of quiet determination. She sat alone at a small table, bent over a notebook, her tongue sticking out slightly as she concentrated. Her clothes were patched but clean, and her eyes, when she glanced up briefly, held a spark that caught his attention. "Hi there," he said, keeping his tone casual. "What are you working on?" The girl looked at him warily, clutching her notebook close to her chest. "A story," she said finally. Her voice was soft, but her words carried a confidence that surprised him. "A story, huh? What's it about?" She hesitated before replying. "It's about a girl who finds her family. A real family, not just one that says they care." Her words struck a chord in Michael's heart. He crouched down to her level, feeling an unexpected pang of empathy. "That sounds like a beautiful story. Do you like to write?" The girl nodded. "It's my favorite thing to do, but I only write happy endings. Sad stories are too hard." Michael smiled, though her answer filled him with a strange sadness. "Happy endings are important. I'm sure your story will have one too." She regarded him thoughtfully for a moment before tilting her head. You're not like the other janitors. You talk funny. Caught off guard, Michael chuckled. You're pretty observant, huh? She shrugged. My name's Rosie. What's yours? Michael, he said, offering his hand. She didn't shake it, but her lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. As she returned to her writing, Michael stood there for a moment, feeling a connection he couldn't quite explain. Rosie had stirred something in him, something that felt a lot like hope. And for the first time in years, Michael felt the faintest flicker of purpose. Michael returned to the Starlight Shelter the next day, feeling a sense of anticipation he couldn't fully understand. The routine tasks, cleaning, organizing, and assisting with supplies, were quickly becoming less of a burden and more of a window into a life he'd never bothered to see. He caught himself looking for Rosie when he arrived. Something about the way she had spoken, her guarded yet hopeful demeanor, stayed with him. She was a child who had clearly endured more than any child should, but she still held on to a dream of something better. The shelter buzzed with activity that morning. Parents came and went, carrying groceries provided by the foundation, while volunteers worked tirelessly to manage the chaos. Michael found himself assigned to the kitchen, helping prepare meals for the families who relied on the shelter for daily sustenance. The head cook, a no-nonsense woman named Clara, quickly put him to work chopping vegetables. You don't look like someone who's spent much time in a kitchen, Clara observed, her sharp eyes assessing him. Michael smirked. You could say that, but I'm learning. She handed him a knife. Well, don't chop off your fingers. I've got enough to do without driving you to the hospital. As Michael worked, he listened to the chatter around him. Volunteers shared stories about the families they had met, their voices filled with a mixture of compassion and exhaustion. He realized how little he'd ever considered the lives of people who weren't in his circle. The stories were raw and unfiltered, each one a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. After lunch was served, Michael spotted Rosie sitting by herself at a corner table. She was hunched over her notebook again, scribbling furiously. Something about her intensity drew him in. Against his better judgment, he decided to approach her. Hey, Rosie, he said, sitting down across from her. What are you writing today? She didn't look up. The ending to my story. Can I hear it? He asked gently. Rosie hesitated, clutching the notebook close. It's not done yet. That's okay, Michael said. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out the right ending. Do you ever get stuck? She glanced at him then, her expression thoughtful. Yeah. Sometimes I don't know how to make the happy part feel real. Her words hit Michael like a weight. He nodded slowly. That's the hard part, isn't it? Making it real. Rosie studied him for a moment before sliding her notebook across the table. You can look, but don't tell anyone. Michael opened the notebook carefully, as though it were something fragile. Her handwriting was small and uneven, but her words were vivid and full of emotion. The story was about a girl who lived in a broken house, longing for a family that truly cared for her. In her story, the girl's dreams came true when a mysterious stranger appeared, offering her a life she'd only ever imagined. It's beautiful, Rosie, Michael said sincerely. You're a talented writer. Rosie shrugged, a flicker of pride in her eyes. It's just a story. Stories can be powerful, he replied. Sometimes they help us see things in a new way. She tilted her head. Do you have a story? Michael paused, caught off guard by the question. I guess I do, he admitted. But I haven't written it down yet. Rosie smiled faintly. You should. Maybe it'll have a happy ending too. The simplicity of her statement struck him. Here was a child who had every reason to doubt the existence of happy endings, yet she still believed in them. It was humbling. Over the next few weeks, Michael found himself drawn deeper into the life of the shelter. He learned about the families who depended on its resources, the struggles they faced, and the small victories they celebrated. Each day, he spent a little more time with Rosie, discovering her sharp wit and boundless imagination. But the more he learned about her, the more questions he had. Rosie never mentioned her father, and when he asked casually about her family, she would only talk about her mother, Maria. Michael noticed how Rosie's face would brighten when she spoke of her mother, but there was always a shadow of worry behind her words. One afternoon, Michael stayed late to help organize a shipment of donated clothes. As he was folding a pile of jackets, he overheard two staff members talking. "Maria's in bad shape," one of them said quietly. "She's been trying to hold it together for Rosie, but it's taking a toll." "I heard she's been skipping her meds again," the other replied. "She can't afford them. It's only a matter of time before her health gets worse." Michael's hands froze. He didn't know much about Maria, but he knew enough to understand the implications of what he'd just heard. The thought of Rosie losing her mother filled him with a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. That night, Michael sat in his penthouse, his mind racing. He had the resources to help Maria, to ensure she got the care she needed. But how could he intervene without revealing who he really was? He opened his laptop and accessed the Foundation's database. With a few clicks, he located Maria's file. It confirmed what he already suspected. She was in dire need of medical assistance. Michael made a decision. He would arrange for Maria to receive treatment anonymously, using the Foundation's resources to cover the costs. The next day, a social worker informed Maria that her medical expenses had been approved for funding. Tears filled her eyes as she thanked the shelter staff, unaware of Michael's involvement. As Michael watched from a distance, he felt a strange mix of relief and unease. He had taken the first step, but it wasn't enough. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, he felt a deep responsibility for Rosie and her mother. That evening, as Michael sat in his penthouse, he found himself staring at an old photograph of Elizabeth. Her words from the letter echoed in his mind. "Make a difference, Michael." He hadn't anticipated how deeply this journey would affect him. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt like he was beginning to understand what Elizabeth had meant. Michael arrived at the shelter early the next morning, his thoughts preoccupied with Maria's situation and the unshakable connection he felt to Rosie. The weight of his anonymous gesture lingered in his chest, both a relief and a source of deeper unease. He couldn't deny that helping Maria had brought him a sense of purpose, but it also left him questioning why he felt so drawn to their lives in the first place. As he stepped through the shelter's doors, the familiar hum of activity greeted him. Children's laughter mingled with the clatter of dishes from the kitchen and the soothing voices of volunteers organizing supplies. For a brief moment, Michael felt like he belonged here, something he hadn't felt in a long time, not even at the towering empire he'd built. Rosie spotted him almost immediately. She waved from across the room, her notebook tucked under one arm. Michael waved back, a small smile tugging at his lips. She hurried over, her curls bouncing as she moved. "Michael," she said, looking up at him with a mixture of excitement and determination. "I finished my story." "You did?" he asked, crouching to her level. "That's fantastic. Can I read it?" Rosie hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Okay, but you have to promise not to laugh." "I would never," Michael assured her. She handed him the notebook, her small hands clutching it tightly for an extra second before letting go. Michael opened it carefully, scanning the pages. Her story had grown since he last saw it. It was about a girl who had been lost in a cold, empty world until she met someone who helped her find a new path, a home filled with warmth and love. The girl and the stranger faced challenges together, and in the end, they discovered they were meant to be a family all along. When he finished reading, Michael looked at Rosie with genuine admiration. "This is amazing, Rosie. You have such a gift." Rosie shrugged, but her cheeks turned pink. "It's just a story," she said softly, though there was pride in her voice. "No, it's not," Michael replied. "It's more than that. Stories like this can change the way people see the world. Don't ever stop writing." Her eyes lit up at his words, and for a moment, she looked like any other child, unburdened by the weight of the world around her. Later that day, as Michael mopped the floors in the main hallway, he overheard a conversation between Rosie and another volunteer. Rosie was explaining her mother's struggle to keep up with work and her constant worry about paying for medicine. The words pierced through Michael like a knife. He had already done what he could for Maria's medical bills, but the deeper issue was clear. Maria was burning herself out trying to provide for Rosie, and it was taking its toll. That night, Michael found himself revisiting the shelter's records, searching for more details about Maria and Rosie's lives. He learned that Maria worked long hours as a cleaning supervisor at a local hotel, but had been forced to cut back her hours recently due to her declining health. Rosie, despite her young age, had taken on small responsibilities around the shelter, helping other children and even organizing small fundraisers with her stories to contribute what little she could. As Michael sifted through the information, a memory surfaced, something he had almost forgotten. Years ago, before he had met Elizabeth, there had been a brief but passionate relationship with a woman named Maria. They had parted ways amicably, their lives heading in different directions, and he had never thought about it again. But now, the coincidence struck him. Could this Maria be the same woman? Could Rosie be? Michael shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was absurd, but the idea lingered, growing stronger with each passing moment. The next day, he couldn't resist the urge to find out. He approached Maria in the shelter's small lounge during a rare quiet moment. She was sitting with a cup of tea, her face drawn with exhaustion but still radiating a quiet strength. "Maria," Michael began, hesitating as he tried to find the right words. "Can I ask you something personal?" She looked at him curiously, her guard slightly up. "Sure, I guess." He took a deep breath. Did we know each other before? Years ago?" Maria's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Her lips parted, but she said nothing for a moment, studying him carefully. "Michael Whitmore," she said finally, her voice a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "It's been a long time." Michael's heart sank. The confirmation was both a shock and a relief. "I had no idea you were here," he said. "I didn't recognize you at first." Maria nodded slowly. "I didn't think you would. It's been over a decade. Our lives went in very different directions." He hesitated, the question burning in his mind. "Rosie, is she?" Maria cut him off, her tone suddenly defensive. "Yes, she's yours. But you were gone, Michael. I didn't know how to find you, and after a while, I stopped trying." The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. Rosie was his daughter, the girl who had unknowingly reignited his sense of purpose, who had brought light back into his life, was his own flesh and blood. "I didn't know," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I had..." Maria shook her head. "What difference would it have made? You were building your empire, and I was just trying to survive. It doesn't matter now." "It does matter," Michael said firmly. "I want to help. I want to be there for her. And for you." Maria's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained wary. "You can't just walk back into our lives and fix everything, Michael. It's not that simple." "I know," he replied, "but I want to try." For the first time in years, Michael felt like he was standing at the edge of something monumental. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't walk away from Rosie or Maria again. The revelation of Rosie's identity left Michael reeling. For the first time in years, he felt the solid ground beneath his feet shift, leaving him unsteady, uncertain, and filled with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Elizabeth's passing. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, he stared at a photograph of Elizabeth on his desk. Her warm, knowing smile seemed to hold a silent challenge, as though she'd known this moment would come. Michael had always been a man of action. Problems were meant to be solved, challenges conquered. But this was different. This wasn't about a business deal or a calculated decision. This was his past colliding with his present, and the stakes were immeasurably higher. He needed to figure out how to move forward without overwhelming Maria or Rosie. He needed to earn their trust. The next day, Michael returned to the shelter with a renewed sense of purpose. His conversations with Maria had been brief but meaningful, and he was determined to show her he meant every word. He began by involving himself more deeply in the daily activities at the shelter, not just with Rosie, but with the other children and families as well. If he wanted to prove he could be a positive presence in Rosie's life, he needed to demonstrate it through his actions. Rosie, as always, was in the playroom, surrounded by a small group of children as she read aloud from her notebook. Michael paused in the doorway, watching her. The way she commanded their attention, her voice animated and full of life, filled him with pride. She had a gift, and he wanted to nurture it, to give her every opportunity to grow into the incredible person he already saw in her. After the story ended, Rosie's audience dispersed, leaving her to pack up her things. Michael approached, his steps careful, as though he were afraid of disturbing her moment of peace. "Hey, Rosie," he said, crouching down to her level. "That was quite a performance. You've got a real talent for storytelling." Rosie looked up at him, her eyes shining with a mixture of surprise and pleasure. "You were listening?" "Of course," Michael replied. "I wouldn't miss it. Have you ever thought about sharing your stories with more people? Maybe even getting one published someday?" Her cheeks flushed, and she shook her head. "No one would want to read them." "I think you're wrong about that," he said gently. "Your stories have something special, Rosie. They make people feel something. And that's a rare gift." She smiled shyly, but the spark of excitement in her eyes told him she was starting to believe him. Over the next several days, Michael worked to bridge the gap between himself and Rosie. He spent more time at the shelter, helping her with small tasks and encouraging her creativity. He didn't press her about their connection, knowing that trust couldn't be rushed. Instead, he let their bond grow naturally, hoping she would come to see him not just as another adult in her life, but as someone who truly cared. Maria, however, remained guarded. While she appreciated Michael's efforts, her years of struggle had left her wary of promises and intentions that seemed too good to be true. One evening, as the shelter was closing for the night, Michael found her in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. "Maria," he began, his voice soft but earnest. "I know you're hesitant about letting me into Rosie's life, and I understand why. But I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I want to be there for both of you, in whatever way you'll allow." Maria paused, her hands stilling on the cloth she held. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "It's not that simple, Michael. You've been gone for so long. I've spent years trying to protect Rosie from disappointment, from getting her hopes up only to have them crushed. I can't let that happen again." "I get that," he said, meeting her gaze. "But I'm not the man I was back then. I've made mistakes, more than I care to admit, but I want to make things right. For her. For you." Maria sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. She's been through so much. Losing her mother would break her. Michael's heart clenched at her words. "That's why I want to help. I can make sure you have what you need, that you're taken care of. You don't have to do this alone anymore." Maria's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly blinked them away. "I want to believe you, Michael. I really do. But trust isn't something you can just buy. It has to be earned." "I understand," he said, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." For the first time, Maria's guarded expression softened, and she gave him a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That weekend, Michael invited Rosie and Maria to spend the afternoon together outside the shelter. He had arranged for a visit to a local bookstore that was hosting a children's storytelling event. Rosie's excitement was palpable as they walked through the aisles, her eyes lighting up at the rows of books. During the event, Rosie had the chance to share one of her stories with the audience. As she stood on the small stage, clutching her notebook tightly, Michael felt a swell of pride unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Watching her confidence grow, seeing the way she captivated the room, filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Afterward, as they sat together in the cafe attached to the bookstore, Rosie turned to him, her face glowing with happiness. "Thank you, Michael," she said, "for believing in me." His chest tightened at her words, and he smiled. "You don't have to thank me, Rosie. I'm just so proud of you." Maria watched the exchange quietly, her expression thoughtful. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man Michael had become. Not the ambitious CEO or the distant figure from her past, but someone who truly cared about her daughter. That night, as Michael walked them back to their small apartment, he felt something shift. It wasn't just about making amends anymore. It was about building something new, something real. And for the first time, he began to believe that a happy ending wasn't just possible. It was within reach. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Michael worked tirelessly to maintain the balance he was trying to create with Rosie and Maria, careful not to overstep but equally determined to prove his commitment. Every small moment with Rosie felt like a gift. Each laugh, each question, and each story she shared with him reinforced the bond growing between them. But with Maria, progress was slower, her walls still firmly in place. One afternoon, Michael arrived at the shelter to find Rosie sitting in the corner of the playroom, her notebook open but her pencil still. Her usual energy seemed muted, and her expression was distant, as though she were somewhere far away. Michael approached cautiously, pulling up a chair beside her. "Hey, Rosie," he said softly. "You okay?" She looked up, her brown eyes clouded with something he couldn't quite place. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice lacked its usual spark. Michael tilted his head, not convinced. "You don't seem fine. Want to talk about it?" Rosie hesitated, her small hands fidgeting with the corner of her notebook. Finally, she spoke. "Mom's been really tired lately. She says it's nothing, but I can tell something's wrong." The weight of her words pressed heavily on Michael's chest. He had known Maria's health was fragile, but hearing Rosie's fear made it all the more real. "Your mom's been through a lot," he said carefully. "She's strong, though, and she has you. That makes a big difference." Rosie nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the notebook in her lap. "I just wish I could do more. She works so hard, and I don't want her to feel like she has to do it all by herself." "You do more than you realize," Michael said gently. "The way you care about her, the way you bring people together with your stories, that's something special, Rosie. And your mom knows it." A faint smile tugged at her lips, but the worry in her eyes remained. Michael knew he needed to do more to support Maria, not just for her sake, but for Rosie's as well. He resolved to speak with Maria directly, to find a way to help her without overstepping the boundaries she had set. That evening, as the shelter quieted down, Michael found Maria in the small office at the back of the building. She was seated at a cluttered desk, sorting through a stack of papers. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded but not unkind. "Michael," she said, her voice carrying a note of surprise. "What brings you back here?" "I wanted to talk," he said, closing the door behind him. "About you." "And Rosie," Maria sighed, leaning back in her chair. "I figured this was coming. I know you're trying to do everything on your own," Michael began, his tone earnest. "But you don't have to. Let me help. Not just financially. I mean really help. Be there for you. For Rosie, in whatever way you need." Maria regarded him carefully, her expression unreadable. "You say that like it's simple, but it's not. I've spent years protecting Rosie from disappointment, from getting her hopes up. Letting you in, it's a risk. For both of us." "I understand that," Michael said, his voice steady. "And I'm not asking you to trust me overnight. I just want the chance to prove myself. Not with words, but with actions." Maria was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on him. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "If you're serious about this, you need to understand something. Rosie is my world. She's all I've ever had. If you hurt her, I won't forgive you." "I would never hurt her," Michael said firmly. "Or you. I promise." Maria's lips pressed into a thin line, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or the faintest glimmer of trust. Over the next few weeks, Michael became a more permanent fixture in their lives. He worked closely with the shelter to improve its programs, ensuring that families like Maria and Rosie had the resources they needed. He also spent more time with Rosie, helping her refine her stories and even encouraging her to submit one to a local writing contest. Rosie's excitement was contagious, her confidence growing with each step of the process. Maria, though still wary, began to lower her guard bit by bit. She allowed Michael to help with small tasks, like picking Rosie up from the shelter or taking her to the park on weekends. Each shared moment felt like a victory, a step closer to the family Michael desperately wanted to be part of. One evening, as they sat together in Maria's modest apartment, Rosie brought out her notebook and began reading a new story she had written. It was about a girl who discovered a long-lost treasure, not gold or jewels, but something much more valuable, the love of a family. As Rosie read, her voice steady and filled with emotion, Michael felt his chest tighten with a mixture of pride and longing. When she finished, she looked up at him and Maria, her eyes wide with anticipation. "What do you think?" she asked. Michael smiled, his voice thick with emotion. "I think it's your best one yet." Maria nodded, her own eyes misty. It's beautiful, Rosie. Just like you. Rosie beamed, and for the first time, Michael felt a sense of wholeness he hadn't known he was missing. In that moment, surrounded by the warmth of Rosie's smile and Maria's quiet presence, he realized something profound. This wasn't just about making amends or fulfilling a sense of obligation. This was about love. Messy, complicated, and beautiful. And he was all in. That night, as he walked home, Michael felt a quiet determination settle over him. There was still so much work to do, so much trust to earn, but he knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The air was crisp the following morning as Michael arrived at the shelter, carrying a freshly brewed coffee for Maria and a small bag of Rosie's favorite pastries. These gestures had become part of his routine, small tokens to show that he was invested in their lives in a way he hadn't been before. Today, however, a new tension simmered beneath his resolve. He had been preparing himself for the conversation he needed to have with Maria, one he could no longer avoid. He found Maria in the shelter's common area, tidying up after breakfast. She looked up as he approached, her expression softening when she saw the coffee. She accepted it with a murmured thanks, her fingers brushing against his briefly. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to steady him. "Maria," Michael began, his tone measured, "I need to talk to you about something. It's important." She raised an eyebrow, taking a cautious sip of her coffee. "That sounds serious. What's on your mind?" Michael hesitated, his hands tightening around the bag of pastries. "It's about Rosie. About us." Maria set her coffee down, her expression shifting to one of guarded curiosity. "Go on." He drew in a deep breath, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I've been thinking a lot about everything. The past, the choices I made, and the ways I failed you both. But I also know that I can't change what's already happened. What I can do is be here now, fully, for both of you. And that means being honest." Maria's eyes narrowed slightly, her posture stiffening. "Honest about what?" Michael swallowed hard, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I've been thinking about how much I missed without even knowing it. How much of Rosie's life I wasn't there for. And I realized something. I don't want to miss another moment." Maria's gaze softened for a split second before the walls went back up. "You say that now, Michael, but what happens when things get hard? When being there isn't convenient anymore?" "I don't care how hard it gets," Michael said firmly. "I'm not walking away again. I'm here for the long haul, Maria. Whatever it takes." She studied him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, the silence between them felt endless. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "If you're serious about this, Michael, you need to prove it. Not just with words, but with actions." "I will," he promised. "Every day, for as long as it takes." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of laughter echoing through the room. Rosie came bounding in, her cheeks flushed from playing outside. She spotted them immediately and ran over, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "Michael, Mom," she said, her excitement bubbling over. "I started a new story. Do you want to hear it?" Maria glanced at Michael, her guarded expression giving way to a small, reluctant smile. "Of course we do," she said, pulling out a chair and motioning for Rosie to sit. Rosie climbed into the chair, opening her notebook to the first page. As she began to read, her voice filled with the same earnest energy that had captivated Michael from the start. The story was about a little bird who had lost its way but found a new home with the help of a patient, kind-hearted fox. Michael couldn't help but smile at the parallels, wondering if Rosie saw them too. When she finished, Michael clapped lightly, his pride evident in his expression. "Rosie, that was incredible. You've outdone yourself." Maria nodded, her smile widening. "It really was beautiful, sweetheart." Rosie beamed, her happiness lighting up the room. In that moment, Michael felt a surge of hope. Hope that he could truly become part of their lives, that they could find a way to move forward together. Over the next few weeks, Michael threw himself even more deeply into the shelter's work. He spearheaded new initiatives to expand their resources, ensuring that families like Maria and Rosie would never have to face the struggles they had endured. He also spent as much time with Rosie as possible, helping her with her writing and encouraging her to explore her talents. One evening, as Michael and Rosie sat together in the shelter's small library, she turned to him with a question that caught him off guard. "Michael, why do you care so much about me and Mom?" she asked, her tone curious rather than accusatory. Michael hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing heavily on his chest. He had been waiting for the right moment to tell her, to explain everything, but now, looking into her wide, trusting eyes, he realized there might never be a perfect time. "Because you're important to me," he said carefully. "You and your mom mean a lot to me, Rosie. More than you know." Her brow furrowed slightly, her gaze searching his face. "Like family?" Michael's throat tightened, and he nodded. "Exactly like family." She smiled at that, the simplicity of her acceptance both humbling and heartwarming. But as she returned to her writing, Michael knew the hardest part was still ahead. He needed to tell Rosie the truth, that he was her father, and he needed to do it in a way that wouldn't shatter the trust they had built. That night, as he sat alone in his penthouse, Michael stared out at the city lights, his mind racing. He thought about Elizabeth, about the wisdom and grace she had carried with her, and he wondered what she would have done in his place. Her words from the letter echoed in his mind. "Find the courage to step beyond the world you know." Michael drew in a deep breath, his resolve hardening. It was time to tell Rosie the truth, to take the next step in this journey, no matter how daunting it felt. Because for the first time in years, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The moment Michael had been dreading arrived on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The shelter was unusually calm, the normal buzz of activity replaced by a peaceful stillness as families and children enjoyed a rare day of rest. Michael had asked Maria for time alone with Rosie, explaining that he needed to talk to her about something important. Maria had hesitated but ultimately agreed, her eyes filled with cautious hope. Michael and Rosie sat together on a worn picnic table in the small garden behind the shelter. Rosie had her notebook open, doodling absent-mindedly on the corner of a page, while Michael gathered his thoughts. He had rehearsed this conversation in his mind countless times, but now that the moment was here, the words felt heavier than he'd anticipated. "Rosie," he began, his voice steady but quiet, "can I tell you a story?" She looked up, surprised but intrigued. "You have a story?" "I do," he said with a small smile. "It's a story I've been waiting a long time to tell." Rosie set her pencil down, giving him her full attention. "Okay, I'm listening." Michael took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Once upon a time, there was a man who thought he had everything he needed. He worked hard, built a big life for himself, and surrounded himself with success. But deep down, he always felt like something was missing. He didn't realize it at the time, but what he was missing was love. Rosie tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. Why didn't he know? Because he was too busy to see it, Michael said. He didn't understand what really mattered. And then, one day, he met someone who changed his life. A kind, brilliant woman who taught him about love and family. She showed him what he'd been missing. Did they live happily ever after? Rosie asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. Michael hesitated, his throat tightening. For a while, yes. But then the woman. She got very sick, and she passed away. The man was heartbroken. He thought he'd lost his chance at happiness forever. Rosie's face fell. "That's so sad." "It is," Michael agreed. "But this story isn't over. Because after the woman passed, the man discovered something he never expected. He found out that he had a daughter, a bright, amazing little girl who had been out in the world all along, waiting for him. And when he met her, he realized that she was the missing piece he'd been searching for his whole life." Rosie's brow furrowed as she processed his words. The man didn't know about his daughter? Michael shook his head. No, he didn't know. But when he found her, he promised himself that he would do everything he could to make up for lost time. That he would be the kind of father she deserved. Rosie was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on him. "Michael, is this story about you?" His chest tightened as he nodded. "Yes, Rosie. It's about me. And it's about you." Her eyes widened, and she drew back slightly, as though trying to make sense of what she just heard. "You're my dad." "I am," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. And I know this might feel confusing or even scary, but I want you to know that I'm here for you. I always will be." Rosie stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "I wanted to," Michael said gently, "but I didn't want to rush things. I wanted to make sure you felt safe and that you could trust me first. Because you mean so much to me, Rosie, and I didn't want to mess this up." Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked down at her lap, her small hands twisting together. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything right now," Michael said softly. "I just want you to know that I love you. I've loved you from the moment I realized you were my daughter, and I'm going to do everything I can to be the kind of dad you need." Rosie sniffled, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt. "You really mean it?" "I do," Michael said, his voice unwavering. "With all my heart." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Rosie reached out and took his hand, her grip small but firm. I think I'd like that." Michael felt a surge of relief and gratitude, his heart swelling with emotion. "You have no idea how much that means to me, Rosie." She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and for the first time, he saw a glimpse of the connection he had been hoping for, the beginning of a bond that would only grow stronger with time. When they returned to the shelter, Maria was waiting in the lounge, her posture tense as she rose to meet them. Her eyes darted between Michael and Rosie, searching for clues about how the conversation had gone. "Mom," Rosie said, her voice steady but quiet, "Michael told me." Maria's breath hitched, and she looked at Michael, her expression unreadable. "And how do you feel about that, Rosie?" Rosie hesitated, then glanced up at Michael before turning back to her mother. I think it's okay. I think it's good." Maria's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm glad to hear that, sweetheart." As they stood together, a tentative but hopeful sense of unity began to take shape. It wasn't perfect, and there were still many challenges ahead, but for the first time, Michael felt like they were truly on the path toward becoming a family. The days following Michael's revelation were marked by a quiet transformation. Rosie was more subdued than usual, her mind clearly working through the weight of the news. She still spent time with Michael, asking him occasional questions about his life and how he had come to the shelter. But there were moments when she would retreat into her thoughts, her notebook unopened in her lap as she stared out the window. Michael gave her the space she needed, answering her questions honestly when they came and offering steady reassurance. He felt an overwhelming gratitude for the chance to build this relationship, even if it wasn't happening as quickly as he hoped. Trust, he reminded himself, took time. Maria, too, seemed different. She watched Michael closely during his visits, as though waiting for him to slip up or reveal some flaw that would justify her lingering doubts. But he remained patient, understanding her caution. Her guardedness wasn't personal. It was a defense she had built to protect Rosie, and he respected that. Slowly, though, her walls began to lower. She no longer avoided his gaze when they spoke, and sometimes, he caught the faintest flicker of a smile when he interacted with Rosie. One crisp autumn afternoon, Michael decided to take Rosie and Maria on a small outing. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a visit to the park near the shelter, where the leaves had turned shades of gold and crimson. Rosie ran ahead, her laughter echoing through the trees as she kicked up piles of leaves. Michael walked beside Maria, their pace slow and unhurried. "She seems happy today," Michael said, his eyes following Rosie's energetic movements. Maria nodded, her arms crossed against the cool breeze. "She's processing everything. It's a lot for a kid to take in, but she's strong." "She gets that from you," Michael said sincerely. Maria glanced at him, her expression softening. "Maybe, but I think she gets her imagination from you. She's always creating, always dreaming. It's one of the things I love most about her." Michael smiled, a swell of pride warming him. "She's incredible. I don't know how I got so lucky." Maria was quiet for a moment, then said, "You're trying, Michael. I see that, and I appreciate it. But I need you to understand something. Rosie and we've been through a lot. It hasn't been easy, and I've had to make sacrifices to keep us going. I can't afford to let her get hurt." "You won't," Michael said firmly. I know I've made mistakes, big ones, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. You have my word. Maria studied him, her expression unreadable. I want to believe you. I really do. You will, Michael said. In time, they reached the park's edge, where Rosie was waiting for them on a bench. She had collected a small pile of leaves and was carefully arranging them into the shape of a heart. When they joined her, she looked up with a proud grin. Do you like it? She asked. It's beautiful, Maria said, brushing a strand of hair from Rosie's face. Michael nodded, his heart swelling. You've got an artist's eye, Rosie. Rosie beamed, and for a moment, the three of them sat together in comfortable silence, the crisp air filled with the sound of rustling leaves and distant laughter. It was a simple moment, but it felt significant, a step closer to the family Michael had begun to hope they could become. That evening, as they returned to the shelter, Rosie pulled Michael aside. She looked up at him with wide, earnest eyes, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Michael, she said, her voice quiet but steady. Do you really think we're like a family? Michael knelt down so they were eye level, his expression serious. Rosie, I don't think it. I know it. You and your mom are my family, and I'll do everything I can to prove that to you. Rosie nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at her lips. I think I like that. His chest tightened with emotion, and he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. I'm glad, Rosie, because I've never wanted anything more. As Rosie ran off to join the other children, Michael felt a deep sense of hope. It wasn't just a promise he was making to her. It was a promise he was making to himself. The following week, Michael surprised Rosie with a special gift. He had worked with a local publisher to print a small batch of her storybooks, complete with colorful illustrations. When he handed her the first copy, her eyes lit up with wonder. Is this really mine? She asked, turning the book over in her hands. It's all yours, Michael said, his voice filled with pride. You've got a real talent, Rosie, and the world deserves to see it. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged the book to her chest. Thank you, Michael. This is the best thing anyone's ever done for me. Maria watched from a distance, her expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. Later, as they cleaned up after dinner, she approached Michael. That was a kind thing you did for her, she said quietly. She deserves it, Michael replied. She deserves everything. Maria hesitated, then said, You're starting to prove me wrong, Michael. I wasn't sure if you could be the person Rosie needed, but you're showing me that maybe you can. Thank you, Michael said, his voice filled with emotion. That means more to me than you know. As the days turned into weeks, the tentative bond between them grew stronger. Michael found himself spending more time with Maria and Rosie, sharing meals, helping with homework, and even joining in their storytelling sessions. Each moment felt like a step closer to the family he had dreamed of but never thought he could have. One evening, as they sat together in Maria's small apartment, Rosie climbed into Michael's lap, her book in hand. She began reading aloud, her voice steady and confident. Michael listened intently, his heart swelling with pride as she brought her characters to life. Maria watched from across the room, a soft smile playing on her lips. In that moment, she saw the man Michael had become. Not the ambitious CEO or the distant figure from her past, but someone who had opened his heart to the people who mattered most. When Rosie finished her story, she looked up at Michael, her eyes shining. Do you think Elizabeth would have liked it? Michael's breath caught at the mention of his late wife, but he smiled through the ache in his chest. I think she would have loved it, Rosie. Just like I do. Rosie grinned, her arms wrapping around his neck in a warm hug. And for the first time, Michael felt a deep, unshakable certainty. This was where he belonged. With Rosie, with Maria, with the family they were building together. The weeks passed with a quiet rhythm, the kind that only comes when something fragile begins to take root. Michael spent as much time as he could with Rosie and Maria, dividing his days between work at the shelter and building memories with them. For the first time in years, his life felt meaningful. But as the bond between them grew, so did his determination to ensure that their future was secure. Michael had begun exploring ways to expand the shelter's reach, working with the Whitmore Foundation to secure funding for new programs. He didn't want to stop at helping Maria and Rosie. He wanted to make a difference for all the families like them. It was the least he could do to honor Elizabeth's legacy and the family he was building now. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Michael sat with Maria on the steps outside the shelter. Rosie was inside, showing her newly printed storybooks to a group of younger children, her excitement lighting up the room. "It's incredible to see her like this," Maria said, her voice soft. "She's always had such big dreams, but now, it's like she finally believes in them." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She's an amazing kid. She just needed someone to remind her of how special she is." Maria turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You've done a lot for her, Michael. For both of us. I wasn't sure if I could trust you at first, but you've proven me wrong." "I'm glad," he said, his voice steady, "because I meant every word I said. I'm not going anywhere, Maria. You and Rosie, you're my family now." Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the guardedness that had defined their interactions melted away. "We're lucky to have you," she said quietly. Michael looked at her, his chest tightening with emotion. "No, I'm the lucky one." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of laughter and chatter drifting out from the shelter. It was a moment of peace, a reminder of how far they'd come. But Michael knew that there was still one piece missing, one final hurdle he needed to overcome. He hadn't told Rosie or Maria about Elizabeth's letter or the fact that she had known about Rosie. It wasn't that he wanted to keep it from them. He just didn't know how to bring it up. The letter felt like a bridge between the past and the present, and he wasn't sure how they would react to it. That night, as he sat in his penthouse, Michael took out the letter and read it again. Elizabeth's words felt like a balm to his soul, a reminder of the love and wisdom she had carried with her. He decided that it was time to share it, to let Rosie and Maria know the full story of how he had found his way to them. The following evening, he invited them both to dinner at a cozy little restaurant near the shelter. It was a small, unassuming place, the kind of spot where families gathered over warm meals and quiet conversations. Rosie chattered excitedly throughout dinner, telling Michael and Maria about the new story she was working on and how she wanted to write a whole series of books someday. After dessert, as the plates were cleared and the evening began to wind down, Michael reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter. He placed it on the table, his hands steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "There's something I want to share with you both," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's a letter from Elizabeth. She wrote it before she passed, and it's part of what brought me here to you." Maria's brows furrowed in curiosity, and Rosie tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "What does it say?" Rosie asked. Michael unfolded the letter carefully, the paper soft and worn from being read so many times. He began to read aloud, his voice steady but thick with emotion. As he spoke, Maria's eyes filled with tears, and Rosie listened intently, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. When he finished, the table fell silent. Maria was the first to speak, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "She knew," she said, her eyes meeting Michael's. "Elizabeth knew about Rosie." Michael nodded. "She did, and she believed that I would find my way to you when the time was right. She wanted me to see what really mattered in life." Rosie's voice was small but steady. "She sounds like she was really nice." "She was," Michael said, his voice soft. "And I think she would have loved you, Rosie, just like I do." Rosie's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and she reached across the table to take Michael's hand. "I'm glad she wrote that letter," she said, "because it brought you to us." Michael's throat tightened, and he gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "So am I." Maria wiped her eyes, a small, wistful smile on her lips. "She must have been an incredible woman." "She was," Michael said, "and I think she'd be proud of all of us for finding our way to each other." As they left the restaurant that evening, the air was crisp and cool, the stars twinkling brightly above them. Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a deep gratitude for the family he had found and the journey that had brought him to this moment. As they walked back to the shelter, Rosie slipped her hand into his, her small fingers wrapping around his firmly. Michael glanced down at her, his heart swelling with love and pride. "Michael," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Can I call you Dad?" The question stopped him in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. He knelt down so they were eye level, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Rosie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You can call me anything you want, but hearing you call me Dad, that would mean the world to me." She smiled then, a bright, radiant smile that lit up the night. "Okay, Dad," she said, the words wrapping around his heart like a warm embrace. As they continued walking, Michael felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He was exactly where he was meant to be. The months that followed were a time of rebuilding, healing, and finding joy in the smallest moments. Michael's life transformed in ways he had never anticipated, shifting from the cold, calculated world of corporate success to the warm, messy reality of family life. Every day brought new challenges, but it also brought new reasons to smile. Rosie thrived. With the encouragement and support of both Michael and Maria, she began to believe in her abilities not just as a storyteller but as someone who could make a difference in the world. Her books, printed in small batches through Michael's efforts, became a beloved fixture at the shelter, inspiring other children to share their own dreams. Rosie's laughter filled the rooms that had once felt heavy with silence, and her stories wove threads of hope through the lives of everyone she touched. Maria, too, began to relax into this new chapter. Her health improved steadily with access to consistent care, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to breathe. The constant worry of how to provide for Rosie eased as Michael stepped in, not as a replacement but as a partner. Maria's guardedness gave way to moments of quiet connection, her trust in Michael growing stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, Michael found Rosie sitting at the small kitchen table in their shared apartment, her face scrunched up in concentration as she worked on a new story. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her with a mixture of pride and affection. "What's this one about?" he asked, stepping closer. Rosie looked up with a grin. "It's about a girl who learns that families don't have to be perfect, they just have to love each other." Michael smiled, ruffling her curls gently. "That sounds like a story a lot of people need to hear." "Maybe," Rosie said, her grin widening. "I think I'll call it Finding Home." The title hit Michael squarely in the chest, and he knelt beside her, his voice thick with emotion. "Rosie, that's a beautiful name." Rosie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It's what happened to us, right? We found home." Michael pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "We did, sweetheart. We absolutely did." That evening, the three of them sat together on the couch, a fire crackling in the small hearth as they shared stories and laughter. Michael couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. The distance between them, once so vast, had disappeared. They weren't just a collection of individuals trying to navigate life anymore. They were a family. But there was one more thing Michael wanted to do. One last piece of the puzzle he needed to put in place. He had been working on it quietly for weeks, careful not to raise Maria or Rosie's suspicions. The idea had come to him late one night as he thought about all the families he had seen at the shelter, all the people who were still searching for their own sense of home. The following week, Michael gathered Maria and Rosie in the living room. They sat together on the couch, Rosie curled up against Maria, her notebook in her lap. Michael stood before them, his hands clasped nervously. "I wanted to talk to you both about something important," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Over the past year, you've both changed my life in ways I can't even begin to describe. You've given me a sense of purpose, of belonging, that I didn't even know I was missing." Maria and Rosie exchanged a glance, curiosity flickering in their eyes. "And because of that," Michael continued, "I've been thinking about how we can take what we've built together and share it with others. How we can make sure that no family has to go through what you went through, what I went through, alone." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folder, handing it to Maria. She opened it carefully, her brow furrowing as she read the contents. Rosie peeked over her shoulder, her eyes wide with interest. "It's a proposal," Michael explained, "to create a new program through the Whitmore Foundation. We'll call it the Elizabeth Project, in honor of my late wife. It'll provide resources for families like ours, single parents, vulnerable children, anyone who needs help finding their way back to each other. I want us to run it together. As a family. Maria looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Michael, this is incredible. I couldn't have done it without you, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. You and Rosie have shown me what it means to truly care, to truly give. This project is about carrying that forward, about making sure no one gets left behind. Rosie beamed, her hands clapping together in excitement. Can I help? Can I share my stories with the families? Michael chuckled, ruffling her hair. Of course, Rosie. Your stories are the heart of everything we're doing. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as the Elizabeth Project came to life. The shelter became the first location to pilot the program, offering expanded services, counseling, and creative workshops inspired by Rosie's storytelling. Families flocked to the new initiative, drawn by the promise of hope and connection. On the day of the program's official launch, Michael stood on a small stage in the shelter's courtyard, Maria and Rosie by his side. The crowd before them was filled with families, volunteers, and supporters, all gathered to celebrate the beginning of something new. As Michael spoke, his voice steady and confident, he looked out at the faces before him and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the legacy Elizabeth had envisioned, the one she had guided him toward even in her absence. And it was a legacy he would carry forward with the two people who had become his world. When the speeches were over and the crowd began to disperse, Rosie tugged at Michael's sleeve. He knelt down, his arms wrapping around her as she whispered in his ear, "Dad, this is the best story ever." Michael's chest tightened, and he pulled her close, his voice thick with emotion. "It's our story, Rosie, and it's just the beginning." As they stood together under the bright autumn sky, surrounded by laughter and love, Michael knew that he had finally found his way home. Every family has a story of love, loss, and finding home. What would you do if a second chance came knocking at your door? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't miss our upcoming videos filled with more heartwarming reunions and emotional journeys. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's next.